Thank you very much, Derek. So hello and welcome everyone. My name is Adam and this is a talk about my lifelong love of bird books and why I now choose to spend a fairly significant part of my personal time producing them. A little about me. Let me just start this off. Right, so I'll have to just run off memory, I think, on this one. So basically, that's me. I'm a 50-year-old male based out of the UK, but actually spending a lot of time in East Africa as well. What I'll be covering in this talk, after a brief introduction, is why bird books are so important to me, and probably you too, actually. I'll talk a little bit about the early preparations of the work that I'll be talking about, which is the forthcoming Birds of East Africa, which will be a fully photographic guide. I'll run through like a review of recent books on the subject of the birds of East Africa. I'll talk a little bit about image sourcing as well, how I photographed some of the more elusive species. I'll discuss the taxonomy, which is one of the biggest headaches, and then filling the gaps and putting the puzzle all together. So let's just start off with my very first bird book, the Ladybird Book of Garden Birds, which I received when I was about 4 years old. And this really stimulated my interest. I wanted to learn what was in my backyard. I was seeing bullfinches, greenfinches, and that sort of stuff. My geography expanded enormously when I went from just my garden bird book to a guide to the British birds. And actually by the age of 6, I'd pretty much memorized the entirety of this book. And my father used to make money off me betting with his friends that I couldn't identify every bird in the book, even at the age of 6. So that was actually quite good fun. The next big thing for me, one that got me really excited, was this series, The Birds of the World. Now, my uncle Richard, on my mother's side, he had this fantastic collection of books, and he had the full bound series of Birds of the World. And it was seeing things like albatrosses, pennant-winged nightjars, cassowaries, things like that, which I knew I just had to see these birds. I felt fully inspired by what I saw looking through these bird books. My first overseas holiday was a family trip to Canada to see other family out there. And of course, a special bird book was required. I was about 6 or 7 by the time I got this book. I've still got it. I've still got my notes within it. And I just remember seeing my first belted kingfisher and being absolutely bowled over and having to look in the book. Blue jays, American goldfinches, killdeers, plovers, all this sort of stuff, which just got me so excited. I just had to see more. Again, that's just the power of the bird book that led me through it. Even towards the latter end of my single-digit age, I was getting excited about what was beyond British shores, and this book was one of my sort of Bibles at the time. I'd just scour through it and just learn how to separate the different warblers, the different finches and birds of prey. It all got me really, really excited. By the time I was 19, I was already making independent trips. I spent a year traveling around Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand on my own, doing a bit of work here and there just to keep myself topped up in the bank account. And then a few years later, I went to Hong Kong. I was working as a cocktail barman out there. And at the weekends, I would, well, not the weekends, midweek when it was quiet, I would swoop off to various places to go and see some really amazing birds, just walking around on my own, just finding whatever I found. And it was an absolute delight. And of course, I couldn't have done that without a really good field guide. And the birds of Hong Kong and South China served me very well indeed. I guess the next kind of chapter of my life really kind of took over. After 5 years of travel, I ended up going to university, got my degree in geography, and fulfilled another ambition in my life, which was to work at the Natural History Unit in Bristol for the BBC. And after a couple of years doing small jobs there and working on small projects, I worked with Chris Packham, which is really good. And then I found I wasn't really enjoying it as much as I thought I wanted to do. I was going to. So I kind of decided to just travel a bit more. I went to work on cruise ships in the Caribbean, then came back to the UK, the first job I could get was actually as an IT recruitment consultant. And then finally I got into TV again with a small little production company in the southwest of England called Denham Productions, and got to make some really interesting programs, mainly about food, but also I made one called The Royal Birdmen for Discovery Channel, and that was a lot of fun. And then romance blossomed in my life. I met Vicky, and together we hatched a plan to move to East Africa. We'd had no experience of working in this area before, but through my birding and my tour guiding and that sort of stuff, which I was already doing by then, I managed to convince people that, yeah, we were a good enough couple to do this. We spent a couple of years in Tanzania. And of course, the absolute joy of it all was just the birding and the photography. This purple-crested turrico was one of many excellent birds in our camp in Katavi. And I was continually sort of taking photos as well as trying to keep the guests entertained and do some guiding with them, introducing them to the bird life as well as the megafauna like this and like that. It was a whole lot of fun, Katavi. Another one of our neighbors there was the wild dog, and such a wonderful place to be. After 2 years in Tanzania, we then went to the Masai Mara in Kenya, where we managed a Nightjar camp for 2.5 years, and another little camp on an ad hoc basis as well. Lots and lots of fun, more amazing game, and fantastic animals. Pretty much every day you had a great game drive with some impressive mammals, but also lots and lots of birds. And I was continually taking photos of birds, really, it must be said, pretty much every day, either walking through camp or taking the occasional sort of 1-hour game drive in the morning. Just seeing lots of great stuff and making some important discoveries as well. Blue swallow is, as we all know, a very rare and threatened hirundine, breeds mainly in Malawi, Southern Africa. But it does migrate through Kenya and Tanzania up to the Lake Victoria region. What we didn't know was that we actually have a really important staging post in the Masai Mara. And this young male was one of a few that we had located. We ended up seeing about 20 of these in and around one of the camps where we were working. And subsequently, every year, we've seen them come through the Masai Mara. One day, one of our interns decided to ask the question, so Adam, what are you going to do with all these photos that you're taking? You should write a book. And as it happens, I've just been talking with Andy Swash at Wild Guides, who ended up being our publisher, about some image use on another project, the Nightjars of the World by Nigel Clear. And he had a couple of my photos for that. He said, look, next time we're in the UK, come over for a cup of tea. We'll talk books and birds and everything else. And sure enough, that happened. And I walked out of that lovely meeting with Andy and Jill with a 2-book deal, basically. And that cannot happen that often. Everyone will tell you that getting into publishing is notoriously difficult. And I believe that to be true. But yeah, I was very much fired up to teach the local guides about the birds that they had around them. In Nightjar camp in particular, we had these 3 species: northern black flycatcher, slate-colored boo-boo, common or fork-tailed drongo as well. But the guides had never seen or recognized northern black flycatcher. So I ended up having these sessions with them, telling them how to identify it. And I found that being able to share that knowledge directly with them and then writing it down was a very easy way for me to make a very user-friendly field guide with no ornithological techno jargon, as I say in the foreword. It was very much a relaxed approach to how to identify the birds, using really nice clear photos. Just about all these were taken in the camp itself. So really nice snippets of information, little pub facts and little bits here about, you'll see in the light text in the middle there about woodpecker toes and that sort of stuff. So it was all very useful. once we'd got the Masai Mara books out, we decided actually it made perfect sense to do Birds of the Serengeti as well, as it's pretty much mostly the same content, but we added a lot more species into that as well. And we made use of a few more pages. We're having these lovely flight comparison shots of here we've got the vultures, here we've got some of the white-rumped swifts, or the 3 white-rumped swifts. And it was a really nice opportunity for me to really make use of the photographs that I was taking in the field and do something with it. We also did animals of the Serengeti. Vicky is a most amazing mammal portrait photographer. And so her prowess really came through in this book. Comparing some of the smaller mammals as well, the mongoose was a lot of fun. We ended up doing another one, the birds of Kenya's Rift Valley. And so it came to be that within the space of about 3 years, I guess, we'd had these 5 books between us. And the conversation then came, what next? And around this point, I must have completely lost my mind, because I said to the publisher, well, you know, what is it that you'd like me to do next? And they said, well, how about the birds of Kenya? And I said, well, you could, but that's 1,100 or so species, and there's only 14 or 1,500 species in East Africa. Let's just do East Africa. They went, great, you're on. Contracts arrived within a couple of weeks, and we were like, whoa, okay. So I decided that I needed help. And I recruited Brian Finch, who I know some of you know, absolutely amazing ornithologist and all-round naturalist. I mean, he's discovered reptiles. He knows all the butterflies of the region, just about all the plants as well. He's famous for producing the entire sound section in Fanshawe and Stevenson's book on the birds of East Africa. He's a well-loved guide in the region, and he had actually steered me on many identifications while I was arriving fresh into East Africa. Looking at what we had to improve upon was quite an interesting time, actually. And so we kind of looked through a lot of the field guides and the books on the birds of East Africa. Now, this one by P.L. Britton is a fantastic book. It's still one of the highest rating bird books of birds in the region on Amazon. 1980, I think it was actually published, but it wasn't a field guide. It hasn't got many illustrations in it, but it's perfect for understanding the status and distribution and habits of many of the birds that arrive into East Africa or belong here. Another one, going back, I think this was about 1990. This is the Field Guide to the Birds of East Africa by Williams and Arlott. This was actually very much the first kind of field guide as such to the birds of the region. And you see here, it's got over 650 illustrations. Here's a sample of those. Now, by modern standards, we may look at these and think, eek, not really that sophisticated. But actually what they did do was serve as a real appetizer for learning more. When you saw this bee eater page, your head was, it was just like, wow, we've got all these bee eaters in the region. Absolutely incredible. You know, I want to see all those. It was so inspiring. I remember having this book, you know, when I was younger and thinking, you know, I really want to go there. I really want to see all these birds. Really fantastic. So Fanshawe and Stevenson. Now, this really is the modern day Bible for the birds of East Africa and all the birders that come here. It really is an astonishing piece of work. It covers absolutely everything. Although the first edition, this one here, 2002, and then the second edition, 2020, the second edition actually had over 100 new species. And you have to think, well, where do those new species come from? Were they all newly discovered species? Were they newly recorded species? And we explored all of this and saw, okay, right. So you've got taxonomic splits going on here. one bird, then becoming two, etc., etc. And it gave us a really good understanding of how to lay out a good field guide in terms of what's expected. They've come under some criticism, I think, in the past for some of their work. The raptors in particular, they're lovely, they're gorgeous, and Brian Small is one of my absolute favorite artists as well. I used to go birding with him when I was living in Suffolk. Top guy. And also John Gale's work as well, first class. But looking at some of the birds where the artist doesn't really live with the bird or understand how it behaves and how it looks, greenballs in particular have always been, they're a difficult group of species anyway, but I found, and many others have told me they've found, enormous problems with identification just using the book itself. Another one, Birds of Kenya and Northern Tanzania. Absolutely amazing book. The late Dale Zimmerman painted the majority of the plates. We've got Don Turner, who's still our East African bird librarian by effect. He has the most amazing mind and is able to produce any amount of material that you request from him about any given species that occurs in the region. And of course, the late David Pearson, who was another Suffolk birder who I had the great fortune to spend some time with him before he passed. Again, the illustrations, some people don't like them. I personally love them. I feel that they capture the essence of the bird even better than the majority of the plates in Fanshawe and Stevenson, which are perhaps more technically correct and perhaps more technically crafted. But do they convey the same essence of the bird? I'd say no, they don't. I absolutely love these plates by Dale. And yeah, absolutely wonderful. Being part of the Wild Guides Princeton team was really the major strength behind our project. Having the support of Robert Kirk in Princeton, having Andy Swash and Rob Still being able to come up with design suggestions and how we can sort of lay out things in a certain way really has helped to focus our efforts. Now, this book came out, this is actually the second edition, and what this showed us is what a photographic field guide could be like. This inspired us to think, okay, what can we do with the images that we take and receive from our 300 plus contributors? Tom, I know, is one, Itai is another. I see them on the call, and thank you guys. And all 300 plus photographers that have now contributed their fantastic images towards our project. We want to make this a real showcase for everybody's work. Because going out into the field, taking these photos, it is a real passion. And if you can then do something really nice with that end result and create something that looks as good as this, then we have a duty as authors and photo gatherers, I guess you might say, to really do it the best we can. And it has been probably the largest and most time-consuming part of my role as one of the authors, is actually managing the entire photographic content. Now, we expect to showcase around 5,000 images within this book. No mean feat. We're trying to cover every single species. We're missing one. I'll talk about that right at the end. But we've got about 1,500 species that we're actually showing in the book. I'll talk a bit more about that. Europe's birds came off the back of Britain's birds and also the second edition. And here's just a snapshot again of what you can do with simple, concise text, absolutely mind-blowing, stunning imagery, and also the science behind it as well, a bit of taxonomy. You'll see at the bottom here, you've got some little taxonomic boxes here telling you about the subspecies that occur. You've got the range maps with a bit of information about where to find the bird. In East Africa, certainly, elevation is really, really important here. Birds that occur in the highlands and the lowlands but look very similar, you should be able to tell which one you're seeing simply based on the elevation where they are found. So we took a lot of guidance from this kind of structure on the page, but I think we're going to add a lot more as well by necessity. Vagrant shrikes here. This also gives you a taster. I mean, these birds are an absolute nightmare to identify at the best of times, but I like to think that, you know, off the back of seeing how it could be done, we're going to do a very nice job of this as well. Again, all down to the imagery of the very talented photographers that have contributed towards the project. It probably goes without saying that the hardest, most difficult birds to photograph are the small forest birds. And we knew from the get-go that this was going to be an enormous problem for us, securing the best images of small forest species. There are some field guides around, and I'm thinking back to the old ones, like Sinclair had one, which was, you know, any old photo would do. We're not in that mindset. We're very much, these photos have to show the features. It's no good just having any old photo. We need the very best quality to show what we're going to do. So I took off into the Usambara Mountains because that was one of the areas in the Eastern Arc where we've got a lot of endemic bird species, and decided to basically focus. And I was in the field for about 6 weeks with a ringing team. They're doing some work for an American scientist, and had all the permits to photograph, to collect the birds. And what I did then was basically I had a small portable studio where I would attempt to photograph the birds within a controlled environment. A lot of these birds will simply not show, even if you're playing a tape, for example, to try and lure them out. They're simply not that bothered about coming out to have their photograph taken. So this is just a sample of the habitat where I was working. This is in the West Usambara Mountains. I'd say the elodopsis group is among the most difficult of all, not only to see, but to photograph. And also illustrations like this, they don't truly convey the differences that you see when you see the bird. And that's no reflection of Brian's illustrations here. They really are incredibly difficult birds to pin down. And you can look at skins. I think most of these birds were photographed, were painted from museum specimens, but you don't really get the jizz of the bird. So here's one, the Eastern elodopsis, or grey-breasted elodopsis, sometimes called the Tanzanian elodopsis. It didn't even exist in the world of taxonomy as a species. It wasn't featured in the first edition of Fanshawe and Stevenson. It's one of those taxonomic splits, this one from pale-breasted elodopsis, which is more widespread. There was only 1 or 2 photos, really blurry ones taken in the hand, I believe. So getting this kind of quality image under controlled conditions was what we required. Again, this to show you pale-breasted elodopsis from Kenya, from which the previous bird was taxonomically split. Having a photo in the hand, yes, you can see some differences. Yes, you can see some plumages. We've tried our absolute level best to avoid any in-hand photos. I know that we've got Shelley's crimson wing, the mythical bird from the Albertine Rift. They're the only photos we've got. So we've by necessity, we've included a few, but we try to avoid it. So pale-breasted elodopsis under controlled conditions, again, looking a lot more sharp, and you can see pretty much all the features. You can see the true shape of the bird, that it's a perching bird. It doesn't spend as much time on the ground as perhaps the illustration, which shows that with a very thrush-like appearance. It doesn't really have that at all. We then move on to mountain elodopsis. which is very small, very diminutive, a bit like a European wren or dunnock in its movements and behavior, incredibly shy. But again, we wanted good quality images. Scaly-breasted elodopsis, showing its beautiful plumage on that breast and flank there. It's a very delicate bird, and the nuances aren't really ever covered in illustrations. So I think we've done, some really good justice to these birds through the images that we've been able to acquire, and also a few other forest goodies. I think some of you have turned up to see the nice photos, so I'll try not to let you down. Here's Jameson's wattleeye, again photographed under controlled conditions in the studio, showing its rear part. This is the male, and here's a female who's slightly paler grey on the back. And again, having these kind of views in the forest is almost impossible, but we will be able to sort of showcase all of the wattleeyes, and we're really proud of the plates that are coming together for that. Grey-chested kakamega, formerly known as the grey-chested elodopsis, but it's no longer known to be an elodopsis at all. It was included on the same plate as the elodopsis family in the first edition of Fancher and Stevenson, but they subsequently moved it together with spotthroat and dapplethroat, which are two even more difficult birds to see than elodopsis, actually. And I'd say that this bird is, it's heard frequently where it occurs in Kakamega and a few spots in Rwanda and Uganda, but getting views is difficult, getting photographs nigh on impossible. So got a lot of love and thanks for Dr. Titus Mboma, who helped me in Kenya. Here he is with the grey-chested kakamega, where we were photographing in Kakamega. And without his help, and also my colleagues in Tanzania, I wouldn't have been able to come close to getting the images that I did. A few other birds we had under controlled conditions. Buff-spotted woodpecker, we put it into the studio. Wasn't interested at all in posing. So I had I'm trying to think, was that hard fast rule? Yes, it was a hard fast rule. 20 minutes in the studio before it got released. If a bird wasn't prepared to sit up and do what I needed, it got released. Thankfully, 90 to 95% of the birds that entered the studio were willing to hop around, jump onto a perch, have their photo taken, and then get extracted by the ringing team, and then were released. But this one sadly never got its beautiful shot taken, but here she is in the hand, looking absolutely gorgeous. Back to the Usambaras and another crippler, the spotthroat. This is an absolutely terrifying bird to photograph. Even seeing that, very, very difficult indeed. But I think I've done it some justice in the studio, showing its gorgeous little spotty throat there. White-chested leafy, ditto, really hard. The colors of this bird are rarely captured by illustrations. They're absolutely beautiful. This olive on the neck, the gray contrasting with the white, and the beautiful rufous tones in the wing coverts and the tail. It's a stunning bird that really is just not conveyed as such in many field guides by illustrators, mainly because they're working from skins, the colors fade, but there's no comparison for a good photo, in my opinion. Other tricky birds, moving away from those skulking, ground-loving birds, we've got the canopy-dwelling birds, which again, almost impossible to photograph very well. With very few exceptions have I seen good photos of this bird, despite it having quite a large range from East Africa all the way down to South Africa. Yellow-throated woodland warbler. The red-headed bluebell, another beautiful bird, very shy. This is the subspecies Kana, which is restricted to northeast Tanzania. It's much bluer grey on the back rather than black-backed. The black-backed version you can see and photograph quite well in Kakamega, but this one, I believe, is the first photograph outside of the hand. And then other birds like the eastern square-tailed Drongo, again, a canopy species, makes a lot of noise, flies away quite quickly and rarely poses for photos. So. And then outside of the studio we go. There's a lot of birds which I knew I wouldn't be able to catch. So I had to go into the forest and get on my hands and knees and go hunting with the camera. This was always my dream bird, the Uganda forest partridge, only discovered in the late 90s, something of a mythical bird. I dedicated 3 whole days out up in the Uganda mountains with a guide, just the 2 of us walking through the forest, walking over leopard tracks, just the 2 of us unarmed walking through the forest. We heard this one calling not too far away. On the left of the frame here, my guide, Hylia, is hiding behind a tree, playing the tape. I'm lying prostrate on the ground, waiting for this thing to come out. It stepped out in the wrong place, but I managed to get this shot just as it stepped out. And yeah, very happy with this. If you want to just compare this photo with anything on eBird or elsewhere, you'll see this is quite a one-off image. It's yeah, my pride and joy. It was the one I always wanted, and yeah, filled with joy. Further travels, leaving Tanzania and Kenya, went into Uganda for some more difficult species. This one's fairly easy to see at certain spots, but getting a nice photo to do it justice was a good challenge. Fox's Weaver, on the other hand, this is not my finest shot. It was taken in the middle of the day. I was hopping around the bush with a very painful case of gout. This species hadn't actually been seen for over a decade, not by anyone, no Ugandan guides, no one. And there were a lot of fears that it may actually have disappeared completely. Luckily, some of the local guides found it. They put the word out, and shortly afterwards, I was out in the field photographing this bird under rather painful conditions, as I say. But thankfully, other people have got better photos, and they've kindly offered to help me out and replace this one with their superior images. But what a bird. Yeah, that was nice. A few firm favorites from the region, the Lake and Buru, African finfoots. They put on a really nice show. Out in Kibale Forest, it was really nice to be able to get some comparison shots of these two. They were feeding pretty much in the same tree, but not at the same time. Yellow-throated tinkerbird on the left and yellow-rumped on the right. Really nice to have that comparison. And I know that Rob Still, our layout editor, is going to have an absolute field day putting these two together and really showing them off at their best, comparing them side by side, annotating the differences and all that as well. A few other further afield trips. This is in the Republic of the Congo. That was a really wonderful trip. I had a wonderful invitation to join some really great naturalists walking around the flooded forests of the Congo, which, as you can imagine, has its upsides and its downsides and its dangers. Walking through the water rather than on land, it's a lot safer, even when you encounter a nice big buffalo having a bath or a bathe rather in the river that you're walking through. This one was very placid and gently walked away not long after we encountered him. Absolute beauty. And in the camp itself, I was able to get some really nice photos of birds which occur in the far west of our East African region, birds that are typically quite difficult to photograph here, only 1 or 2 sites where they're reliable, and actually having something like a dwarf kingfisher outside your tent in the morning was an absolute joy. Icterine greenbull, again, going back to greenbulls, they're a nightmare. This is one of a couple of different greenbull species I was able to photograph there. I'd never seen it well in East Africa, just fleetingly. So yeah, I maximized the opportunity and probably I fired off about 300 images of this individual. This isn't the finest one, it's just one for effect. Beautiful birds. And then last November, December, I took a visit to Ghana for some other special birds. Again, something like Congo serpent eagle, it occurs 1 or 2 sites in Uganda. Maybe seen once every 2 or 3 years, very rarely photographed, if ever. I was very fortunate to be with a group, and we encountered this bird. They were a bit slow behind me. I managed to just get in prime position, got this photo. They finally caught up, and we all got fantastic views. I managed to get everyone on it in a plantation. It's actually in a rubber plantation, not in primary forest. And it was an absolute joy to see. Other goodies like the standard winged nightjar. This one's a non-breeding male. We tend not to see that many in this plumage in the region, but we do sometimes in northern Uganda when they migrate. But I've never had the privilege to get up close and personal to those. African piculet. This was another absolute nail biter for me. I had a bit of a tummy upset and had to run back to the vehicle when the group had this bird on the first occasion, so I missed it. Luckily, I found this one and was able to get some really nice eye-level shots. I mean, this bird is, as you probably know, it's related to the woodpeckers. The body is about the size of a golf ball. It's very, very small, very, very quiet. And what a privilege it was to photograph this female in the forest. Another one of the tiny ones that we don't really see that often. I've never seen this bird in East Africa, despite many attempts of going into the right habitat, right time, with the right people. Tit Hylia, the smallest bird in East Africa. Absolutely tiny. And yeah, again, a real privilege having the chance to photograph it. As well as those sort of rare species, what we also want to try and do within this book is to capture the variations in plumage. I'm big on variation. I think being able to show the readers how different a bird can look at either any time of year, male and female, different subspecific plumages, or even in this case, just a morph, a variant. This sort of red-breasted morph I'd seen once briefly in Castle Forest on Mount Kenya. Really wanted to photograph it. It never came close. I had to wait another year or so before I got this one, just showing off. Yeah, variation, hugely important. Also on the travels, went to Rwanda and was unsuccessful to photograph the one remaining species for which nobody has ever photographed alive, which is the Albertine Outlet, a very diminutive forest owlet, quite similar to the barred owlet that you see across Central and Southern Africa. Elsewhere in West Africa, there's a few places, but it is a fully worthy taxonomic species. Lincoln Fishpool just produced a paper earlier this year proving beyond doubt that it was very much a different species to any of the other variants or subspecies of barred owlet. Anyway, it remains enigmatic for now. We've got good people on the ground there who I communicate with frequently. They're not seeing the bird, but there are some new trails opening up sometime next year, and I'm very much looking forward to getting in there to try my luck again, maybe armed with some thermal imaging hardware to try and spot these things when they're roosting in the daytime. But for now, that's the one remaining species that we don't have an image for. We've got ideas about how we could present this bird in the book, but I won't spoil the surprise just yet. Taxonomy, what a headache. It's one of those things I've learned to love, but boy, trying to get it right for this book was a nightmare. Who do you follow? You have to have some kind of guideline. BirdLife was the one I was most in love with when I started the book. It was something which I had a lot of time for, but then subsequently with the changes with Clements, eBird, IOC, and everyone else, the bird list kind of slightly fell out of favor. They stopped putting as much work into it. Some of the splits I noticed were a bit exaggerated. I discussed this with quite a few other or a few experts, and they agreed that actually no, that's a bit of a stretch. So Clements, really, really popular. eBird runs off it, of course, but it's not as good as I need it to be, or we need it to be. IOC was the same. But what's really annoying is that there is still this enormous gap, this chasm between these lists. And talking with Nigel Collar, who pretty much manages the BirdLife list with others, he said it's still going to be at least a decade before there's any kind of close alignment between these three lists. So what were we to do? Were we going to put our eggs in one basket? No, we decided not to. We decided to take the opportunity to actually help those lists come together with our own knowledge and the expertise of others. We decided we were going to do our own list, formed mainly by all these three lists and some of the older literature as well. I'll explain about what I mean by that a little later. But it was really important for us, and we were guided to some degree by Nick Burrow, who is a consultant on the book, Mr. Africa himself. Absolutely thrilled to have him on board the consultation team for this project. But he said, you can't be making up species. And I fully agreed with him, actually, after it settled down, because me and Brian had some crazy ideas about some things we wanted to split, but we decided, no, you're right. So anything that's in our guide is on one of these lists, with one or two exceptions that I'll talk about just coming up here, because there's still a lack of knowledge and understanding about what we have in the East African region, where we've got a lot of great stuff which people aren't talking about. This one I'm showing off for Derek, because I know Derek is crazy for the weavers. The Euplectes weavers, any kind of weaver. Derek loves a weaver. I've watched his Learn the Birds presentations, and I know he's mad for weavers. So this one's for you, Derek. And if you don't know Learn the Birds, I implore you to look for some of Derek's amazing webinars. The one on weavers just blew me away when I watched that a few months back. Absolutely loved it. And I learned so much. It was terrific, Derek. So this one's for you. Redheaded Weaver, you see here at the top, is treated in Stevenson and Fanshawe as one species with three distinct races. Actually, the red weaver, Jubaensis, at the top there, that has now pretty much been universally accepted as a species in its own right. I think it's just a matter of time before the nominate and the leuconotus subspecies are split as well. They are quite different. There was talk of there being a hybrid zone in central southern Tanzania. I don't believe it. I've seen no evidence of that at all. They're quite different birds. If you look at not just the facial patterns of the two males there at the top, also look at the wing coverts color and also the secondaries color as well. They're bright yellow in southern Redheaded Weaver and the bright red orange in the northern. So we've kind of made it clear that there is scope for a split, but we haven't actually split it. We simply say it's probably worthy of a split. And I think that's the best that we can do without falling foul of the Nick Burrow rule of making stuff up. So watch this space. We've got a rule, we'll stick to it, and hopefully Nick approves. Along the way, we've got a lot of new arrivals that have just arisen through further research and understanding. Now, Per Olstrom and Paul Donald, they've done a lot of fantastic work on larks in the region. And only just a few months ago, they released another fascinating, groundbreaking paper on larks. In particular, the rufous-nape lark complex. Many of you will be familiar with rufous-nape larks. This one, which occurs in Nairobi National Park, has now been split. Brian Finch, my co-author, actually was lucky enough to call it Sentinel Lark, and Per Olstrom agreed that it was a fantastic name because it does often sit on the road markers on the top and acts as a sentinel. Great name, very apt to its behavior, and you can see clearly there's almost no rufous on the crown. Now, even our Tropicalis in Western Kenya, doesn't have much rufous on the nape, unlike the southern African birds. It does have rufous on the crown and a lot on the wing, but it is now a different species. So we've been allowed to get that in the book and highlighted. This is an interesting one because currently none of the taxonomic bodies, the world checklist, none of them split it. We've got a fantastic dedicated ornithologist who has a lot of experience in East Africa by the name of James Bradley, and he let me know that he's going to be working on a paper to split these. The Citriniceps subspecies of green-capped Eremomola is the top one, and the bottom one, this is actually the one we have in Kenya, Kikuyuensis. As I say, they're not currently split in any other book, however, or sorry, on any other list, but there is historical record of these two being classed as different species. So if you go back to, what was it, 50s, 60s, Mackworth, Praed and Grant in their fantastic books, they actually did separate these two. So there is a historical record of these two being treated as different species. During the 60s, where a lot of stuff got lumped by the likes of White and others, they got merged into, or lumped into a single species, the green-capped Eremomola, which occurs all the way from Kenya down to South Africa. But actually the evidence is very good for splitting yellow-headed Eremomola. It was called the yellow-headed bush warbler by Mackworth, Praed and Grant, which is why we've chosen to use yellow-headed. Bush warbler has fallen out of fashion for this group. They are Eremomolas. And so, yeah, so there is historical record. So we are following that and splitting these. But boy, is there still so much to learn. And the problem about when you start a project like this, the more you research into it and you try and make sure that you've got your facts straight. And we know damn well that not every author is doing this. They're not going to the same lengths, but we have gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure that what we present as fact is fact. And we're very proud of that. Let's take Melodious Lark as an example. When Brian Finch first delivered me a batch of manuscript text for the larks, I had a look at what we had. Now, Brian was the very first person to point out that white-tailed larks, east and west of the Rift Valley, were different species, were different. We didn't know they were different species, but he said they're clearly different. And this was actually written up on the African Bird Club forum. Like, it's on the internet, you can Google it somewhere. But Brian said, this is back in 2006, 2008, we've got a number of bird species here in East Africa that aren't being recognized. But this white-tailed lark complex, east and west of the Rift Valley, that needs further investigation. Now, it took a very long time, but we had great help. Stratton Hatfield got involved, who spends a lot of time in the Mara. He got some fantastic video recordings of this bird singing. I was working in the Mara. I was seeing this lark. I was familiar with it, but I couldn't put a name to it. Well, the best we could say was it's kind of like a white-tailed lark. It's got white outer tail feathers, but what is it? And by pure chance, one day I was looking through Birds of the World, the BirdLife version, before that kind of got taken away. And I was looking at white-tailed lark, and then I just flicked through a couple of other species, and I saw melodious lark. I thought, well, they're so similar. But then I read the text about what they sounded like, and the description of the vocalization for melodious lark was pinpoint perfect for the bird that Stratton had videoed just like a few weeks before. I sent out an email to the group, and we were thoroughly excited when we realized this bird was actually a melodious lark. Now, part of the job of us trying to make everything legit with our book is we have to publish. And again, this is why it's taken us around 10 years to get to the point where we're hopefully going to be publishing next year. So we wrote this paper. You'll see we got Brian's name first. It's always been his baby, these white-tailed larks. But the map on the inset here at the bottom is showing the major red blotch in South Africa. There's a population disjunct in Zimbabwe as well. And in the little black box, you can see out of the spot up in southwest Kenya and northern Tanzania. And we're very pleased that we had great support from Per Olstrom, Paul Donald, other great birders as well, Callan Cohen and many others that you'll see there, who contributed towards this paper to prove that melodious lark was our bird. So that was a big stepping stone for us. Another bird, here we go, Ruvu Weaver. This photo here was one I took in 2008. I'd only been in Tanzania and East Africa for a few months when I was in the Selous Game Reserve and photographed this bird. It simply didn't look like an Eastern Golden Weaver to me. Everything about it, it was just, there were so many subtle differences. We had them side by side, these birds, and it never sat comfortably with me that this was an Eastern Golden Weaver. Anyway, thankfully, the likes of Don Turner were at hand to provide the library detail of the taxonomy of this bird. And again, it had a name. There is historical context for this being a different bird, as shown in this article that Don and I put together. So yeah, and sure enough, even now, the other checklists have now followed the lead and have accepted Ruvu Weaver as a species. So that's another one that we can chalk up. This one here is peculiar. This is one of the ones we simply don't know what it is yet. We need some pretty hardcore sampling of specimens. Basically, when I was in Uganda with a fantastic guide, Brian, and he said to me, "Hey, have you heard about the all blue gray paradise flycatcher that we have in Uganda?" I'm like, "No, I never heard of that." I said, "But it sounds like Bedford's flycatcher." He said, "Yeah, but it doesn't. But it has a long tail." I went, okay. So I've got to come and see it. And part of one of the expeditions I did, I managed to get to the site where this bird was found and managed to photograph it. I think this was one of the first photos of this individual population within Queen Elizabeth National Park. And yeah, sure enough, it's different. It's somehow different. We don't know if it's a color morph of an African paradise flycatcher, a red-bellied, or sometimes called black-headed paradise flycatcher, or does it have a bit of Bedford's paradise flycatcher genetically within it as well? We just don't know. But without catching it, taking a sample, we're not going to know. But what we have done is we've showcased this within the book as a variation. I talked before about variation with the bushwhacks. Sure enough, no sooner had I put word out that I then hear about other grey paradise flycatchers. This one was in an article, I think, Bulletin of the African Bird Club. Mysteriously, it just turned up in southeast Nigeria. And I've corresponded with the author since, and we're just trying to work out if there's any similarity or perhaps a relationship between their bird and our bird. I don't think there is, but they're all part of the same Terpsiphone group. So somehow, somewhere, we'll find out more with further investigation over time. But Maramagambo paradise flycatcher is its tentative name until we know exactly what it is. Other things we know are in East Africa. So these are some pretty poor photos of mine of a bird way up in the canopy, chestnut-capped flycatcher. It's an absolute beauty, moves a lot, it doesn't keep still for long. And I photographed this in Semliki National Park, which borders Uganda and DRC. And basically, this bird was only known from Drongo forest in northwestern Uganda. It's not on the maps anywhere else. Britain has no record of it, Stevenson, Fanshawe, so on, so forth. So again, if we're going to produce maps that show that a bird occurs here, and that's contra to perhaps what Stevenson and Fanshawe may say, or Britain may say, we need to have this documented somewhere. So again, this is why it takes so long for a book like this to come out. We have to be very, very thorough indeed. And yeah, we do our best. But some birds we simply cannot put a name to. Yes, it's a gull. Well done. But what gull? Is it a Caspian gull? Is it a yellow-legged gull? Is it a Mongolicus? Is it a Barabensis steppe gull? We simply do not know. And what's worse is that all of the laryphiles, the gull lovers, have pored over this and they simply cannot agree. So the world's experts cannot agree what this gull that I photographed on Lake Naivasha is, which is a real head scratcher, a real pain in the butt when you want to put a name to a photo in your book. Whatever it is, it hasn't actually been officially recorded in East Africa yet. There's no records of it. And we're still working on exactly what it is. Tentatively, we believe it's an Eastern Cachinans, which is an Eastern Caspian gull, but its wing formula isn't perfect for that species. It's got a bit of Barabensis, the steppe gull, mixed in as well. We don't know if it's a hybrid population. We don't know if it's a group living in Kazakhstan somewhere and then perhaps migrating this way. We simply don't know. So we'll do our best to make that clear that these birds occur. We're not quite sure what it is. We cannot put a name to everything, but we try our best. Now this is another head scratcher. I was in some leafy forest trying to get photos of white-bellied kingfishers, and the juvenile on the left here, awaiting a food pass from the adult. It came along, and I got some nice photos of the juvenile. I'll show you in a second of the juvenile, but this was the important food pass, and I literally pushed myself up against a muddy bank, waiting for the adult to come in because the juvenile was begging, and it did come in very briefly, about 2 seconds, and I got a few photos. But what this bird shows, to me anyway, is that it's not a white-bellied kingfisher. Yes, it's got a white belly, but you will notice the breast is almost evenly orange like the rest of the underparts. But more importantly, it's got this white flare between the eye and the bill. And this white flare isn't documented anywhere. It's a very strange bird. Here is the white-bellied kingfisher from West Africa. Just for clarity, I've taken this one off the internet, and it belongs to Andre Corzal. You'll see that there's no suggestion of any white flaring at the front between the eye and the bill in the lures. The coloration is also spectacularly different. This has white from the chin all the way down to the belly, and overall the coloration is very different to the bird that I saw. I'll just go back and show you again. You know, that it simply isn't the same bird. It's more like a river kingfisher, this one from Europe, or perhaps even a malachite. The crown pattern on this one indicates it's got some kind of malachite kingfisher complex going on. There's some really sparkling blue feathers in there on that crown of the adult. We're just not sure what it is. But remarkably, I was talking to Lincoln Fishpool, who works with Nigel Collar very closely on the bird life list, and he was going to the Belgian museum, and he managed to take some photographs for me, which I'll show you in just a second. But here is the juvenile bird, which was previously being fed by the adult. This one was fresh out the nest, and you can see these white laurel spots. They're almost like little flashlights, and the way they move around, and simply not present on any other known subspecies of white-bellied kingfisher. It simply isn't a white-bellied kingfisher as far as I'm concerned. Now, these are from Lincoln, and what you'll see from the top photo is a side view of the bird, and without blowing the feathers or doing anything to them, he simply moved the camera, and you can see this white flashlight bulging out between the eye and the bill. Now, this really is amazing, because it simply isn't documented in Kingfishers of the World or anything else. It needs further investigation, but for now, all we can say is it's known as white-bellied kingfisher, but further investigation will reveal it's something quite different. And again, on the crown of this bird on the top photo, you can see that's very much like a malachite, quite long feathers, which almost certainly are erected at some time. One of the few successes, well, I say few, put myself down, one of some successes that we've had as well, just scouring so many photographs for this book, inevitably something magic is going to happen. And I realized that we have two species of bar-tailed trogon occurring in our region. The bird on the right is the eastern bar-tailed trogon. It lives in eastern Kenya, throughout Tanzania and down into Malawi. I think there's a record in Zambia as well. But yes, its bill is ivory colored. It has a little subocular spot, but no gape flange. If you look on the bird on the left, this is the western bar-tailed trogon. Its bill is golden yellow. Its gape flange is significant, and it also has the golden orange ocular spot. But what you can't see so well on here is actually the wing bars. Now, if you look on the left-hand bird, you're going to see just above the primaries there, the coverts are showing these white lines. These are thick and broadly spaced. On the right-hand bird, the eastern one, these are fine and narrowly spaced. Lincoln Fishpool and myself, we spent some time at Tring actually measuring the distances and how many lines you get per inch. And that was all published. Here's the paper, beginning of it anyway, where we describe this new bar-tailed trogon. So again, just thanks to all the photographers that contributed, 300 plus of them. Without their kindness, we wouldn't be making these discoveries. It is down to everyone that we're learning all this stuff. It really is a team effort all round. I can't emphasize that enough, that we couldn't do half the stuff we're doing without the contribution, and also from Derek Keats as well, who's another one of our fine contributors. So thank you for that. And I'll almost sign off with this revelation. So there is at least one species, and I'll probably just leave it at one species for now. In Fanshawe and Stevenson, that is not a valid taxon, despite it occurring on every single current world checklist. It was fairly recently described, but cut a long story short, I can't say too much until we're published. As I put at the bottom, yet another paper is being written to validate our findings, but this particular bird has been confused. It is a long story. You'll have to read the paper. It could be really exciting, but basically a bird species is actually going to be removed. So I'm sorry if you've been birding in the highlands of southern Tanzania, but you might be losing a species off your world checklist at some point. Yeah, I'll come to that another time, but it all will be revealed in a paper and hopefully in the book as well. I wanted to say thank you for watching, and thank you for joining. Thank you for joining the Learn the Birds community. I'm thrilled to have done this for Derek and at least partly return the favor of his kindness. Derek, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or would you like to open up for questions and things like that? Yeah. Is there anything?
No, thank you very much, Adam. This is an amazing presentation and an amazing, really amazing body of work. I'm blown away. Folks, if you've got any questions, please just type them into the chat. Do you want me to read them, or do you want to read them, Adam?
Yeah, I'm just going to try and move my mouse. I'm just going to try and stop my sharing.
You can stop sharing, and that will give you your screen back, I guess.
There we go. Right. Here
you
we
are
go.
Still sharing.
Am I? Oh, that's okay. I can read now. I've managed.
Okay. Seems like we've lost Adam. Is anybody else still there? Can you type in the chat if you can hear me? Just so I can make sure it's not me that's disappeared.